Well, for centuries, satire has been used as a means of social commentary, criticizing and ridiculing governments, organizations, individuals, or society itself. Joining us now for more on the modern interpretation of satire and whether or not some topics should be off limits, from Bristol, UK, via Skype, Tariq Modood, founding director of the University of Bristol's Research Centre for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. Also on Skype from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Michael De Adder, editorial cartoonist whose works have appeared in the Toronto Star, the Halifax Chronicle Herald, Brunswick News, and the Hill Times. And with us here in our Toronto studio, Natalie Neal, professor at York University's English Department, where she teaches a course on satire, and Megan Bowler, professor of education and media at the University of Toronto. She's also the author of Digital Media and Democracy. Welcome to all four of you. Thank you for joining us. Let me begin with our guest who's the furthest away, and that is you, Tariq, because you are at least geographically closest to the events that played out this week in Paris. What went through your head when you heard about the murders this week at Charlie Hebdo?
Well, obviously there was a shock, disbelief to some extent at the scale and the rapidity with which it had been done. Of course, I knew the journal, the magazine, by reputation, and the fact that it was willing to provoke Muslims, provoke controversy. So I knew that it had been under threat. In fact, it had been firebombed on one occasion. So there was a sense in which it was believable after all. Not that that makes it a tiny little bit justifiable.
All right, I want to bring up three of the cartoons that Charlie Hebdo has published, the three that are the most controversial that they published about the Prophet Muhammad. And the reason we're bringing them up here at TVO, every Canadian media institution has made their own decisions, but TVO has decided it is not to make a political point, nor to gratuitously insult anybody, but more that we feel that it's important to show what these 12 people were murdered for. So let's take a look at them. Here's the first one. The translation into English is, "No terrorist attack in France yet. Just wait, we have until the end of January to present our New Year's wishes." That, of course, came out in 2015, so in the last number of days, the day of the attack at Charlie Hebdo. The next one says, "Sharia Hebdo, 100 lashes if you don't die of laughter." And the third cartoon we want to show says, "Love is stronger than hate." Okay, Natalie, you have taught a course on satire. This is a satirical magazine. What do you think of those cartoons?
They are certainly deliberately provocative. They set out to shock and offend, but that's a long-standing tradition in satire. Satirists have always set out to use shock as a tool to jar readers or viewers, as the case may be, out of their complacency, to question the status quo, to question those in power. So yes, they're shocking, but not surprising. That's what Charlie Hebdo set out to do, to be provocative.
What about you, Megan? Within the realm of satire, what do you think of these cartoons?
Well, it makes a great deal of sense that Hebdo would publish these cartoons. They have a long history of wanting to produce satire that doesn't mince any words, that really goes against what many people would find quote-unquote tasteful, but as we've seen now, and I'm sure we will discuss, they believe strongly in freedom of expression. And France itself has, as you just said, has a very long history of using satire to bring attention to the vice and folly and errors and mistakes of politicians and such. There is another French saying that it is best for satire to punch up rather than down, and I hope that's something we can talk about.
Well, let's talk about it now. What do you want to say about that?
What's interesting and important to me about that, having studied satire, is that the idea of satire punching up rather than down is that we might want to define a notion of political satire, of effective political satire that would be distinguished from satire in general. So one example I would give of satire that punches down and was not, in my opinion, effective political satire is some of the work of Sacha Cohen and the film Borat, in which he claims to be making fun of American values, but he does that by, quote unquote, punching down. He points the finger at everyday American people rather than at American politicians or American media institutions in the way that we might argue Colbert and Jon Stewart always point the finger at politicians and at media. That is the purpose of their political satire.
Okay, we'll talk about punching up and punching down and punching against power rather than the powerlessness. I want to bring up that third cartoon that we had shown just a little earlier, and I just want to point out that this was the cartoon that Charlie Hebdo ran shortly after its offices were firebombed a few years ago. And Michael, let me come to you, whether it's this one or the previous two that we have shown. I mean, this is your business. You're a cartoonist. So when you look at these, what goes through your mind and what's been going through your mind these last couple of days?
Well, when I look at these cartoons, being in the profession, I see nothing wrong with them whatsoever. I, in fact, like the last one you showed the most because that sends a clear message that Charlie's going to stay in business and you can't stop freedom of speech. As far as punching up or punching down, I think cartoonists don't really define that. I think we just punch, and it's up to editors to decide whether or not we're punching up or down or sideways or left or right.
So as a cartoonist, you didn't see these, I don't know if the right word's egregious, but you didn't see them out of the realm of what cartoonists should be doing.
Well, as a cartoonist, I've seen far worse in the world than these cartoons. But you know, I'm not Muslim, so I mean, and I'm not very religious. So what I'm offended by is very small. In fact, I don't even know if I've ever been really offended by an image ever. Certainly, I've seen some pretty outrageous things on the internet, and nothing that I would pick up a gun and go shoot people over.
Tarek, let me come to you. What do you think of those cartoons?
Well, I suppose the first question really is, who is the figure meant to be? Is it meant to be a Muslim terrorist? In which case it seems fair game. If it's meant to be the Prophet Muhammad, and it doesn't say that it is, but to show the Prophet Muhammad armed with a rifle and ammunition and saying, we have the end of the year to come and attack you and so on. I mean, what is the suggestion? What are they trying to say about the Prophet Muhammad? And that is something, of course, that a lot of Muslims will find offensive. So I think it does depend on who the figure is.
I mean, not knowing the intention, I mean, is this okay for you within the realm of satire? Are you saying, well, if it's, you know, a Muslim alleged terrorist depicted versus Muhammad, that satire, we can draw a line at how far satirical cartoons can go?
Well, I mean, there'll always be lines. Even for Charlie Hebdo, I'm sure there were some lines. I mean, for instance, they're bringing out a commemorative issue, a special issue shortly that they're going to print 1 million copies of, and I would be very surprised if they satirize the people who've been killed, for instance. You know, their colleagues that were killed. Presumably they'll want to take a more solemn note of bereavement in relation to them. So they obviously don't want to satirize anything and everything. Where some feelings are important, they will draw a line. I also think in relation to the issue about satire and power, I think that's a very important issue. Satire, as I understand from many satirists, they always say satire is about truth speaking to power. It is about the pen being mightier than the sword or mightier than politicians and authority and so on. But to satirize groups of people, for instance, rather than powerful individuals like prime ministers and presidents and so on, like the Jews, as the Nazi magazine Der Stürmer used to do in the 1920s and 30s. I don't think many people would think, oh, that's just satire. I think that images of Muslims that are meant to stigmatize Muslims as terrorists or oppress women and so on, the generality of Muslims just like that. I think they're very comparable to the Nazi-type cartoons and satires of Jews, because they reinforce stereotypes. And I don't say reinforcing stereotypes is the purpose of satire.
I can see both our professors in the studio nodding their heads. You agree with that, Natalie?
I do.
Yeah.
Well, to an extent, I think it's an important distinction to be made. What position does the satirist have? You know, is it a position of power, or is the satirist a marginalized figure critiquing power? However, my own view is really that nothing should be off limits for a satirist. So I guess in that sense, I don't agree fully. The quotation that's been attributed to Voltaire, the great French satirist and champion of freedom of speech, is, I'm paraphrasing, I may detest what you say, but I defend your right to say it. And that reflects my attitude towards satire. So I don't think anything should be off limits.
Okay, I want to bring up some more cartoons. It's another series. We got 3 or 4 of them here, and these are some of the cartoons that have been drawn and published in the last couple of days as a response to the attacks on Charlie Hebdo offices. Here's this one, an image that is obviously reflective of the Twin Towers with a plane headed towards us. Let's bring up the next one here. We'll just let these linger for a bit. There's that one, and then let's bring up our third cartoon. And let me come to you on this point, Megan. What do you think of these visual responses?
Well, I think these visual responses raise important questions, and one of the links I would make between those and the previous set of comments is that it is valuable, while I agree with my colleague, it is valuable to draw a distinction between freedom of expression and laws that work to protect people from hate speech. And so if we're going to look at the question of freedom of expression, I think it's equally important to raise questions about hate speech. And what is hate speech? Hate speech is understood as speech that offends, threatens, or insults groups based on race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, disability, or other traits. So the point about power would be precisely here, where you would ask, is it the case that right now, in general, Muslim communities and individuals are marginalized in many communities because of the aftermath and the propaganda following September 11th? Given that, would we want to be very careful about what kinds of speech we use to depict people who are marginalized in any way? And that's where the question of satire and power is so important.
And what's your answer to that question? What do you think about it yourself?
I would not want to go down the slippery slope of saying, let's censor such and such an image, but I think it is very important that people become aware of these differences. And I think it's really important to mention that in the wake of what has happened in France, there's a hashtag called Voyage avec moi that builds on recent terrorist extremist attacks in Australia, Sydney, where people created a hashtag, I'll ride with you, because they were very aware, as they are in France, of the difference between extremist, violent radicals and everyday people who are of Muslim identity. And so there's this reaching out, stand with Muslims, and people willing to ride with Muslims on buses in France right now to make sure that they are safe.
Michael, I guess, though, there's an assumption on that we all agree on who holds power and who is marginalized if we sort of make these distinctions. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure that you can have free speech and have an asterisk behind it and say this is hate speech, and you can't say that either, or you can't have that. I'm not sure what the difference is. You have to be able to defend even the stupid people when you're talking about freedom, true freedom of speech. Even as far as drawing the Prophet Muhammad goes, I personally have never drawn the Prophet, and I can't see why or how I'd ever. I have no reason to draw him. When you draw the Prophet, you're saying all Muslims are this, and really who I'm trying to attack usually in a cartoon are the extremists or the terrorists. So you can't really paint that big wide brush and call all Muslims, in a cartoon, there's just no reason. There's other ways. There's thousands of ways to say something and thousands of ways to different approaches. There's always a different way. So I've found it never, ever necessary to draw like the prophet. And in the same extent, I don't think I've ever drawn Jesus for the same reason.
I want to bring up, Michael, your visual response to what happened this week in Paris. Can we bring up Michael's drawing there? Can you just tell us about this, Michael?
The cartoon process of coming up with an idea is much like making sausages. It's kind of not a straightforward line. You just don't go, hey, there's my idea. That morning I woke up my usual time and I turned on the television set to find out like the immediate news, and I was getting ready to turn on to open the newspaper, and all this was going on, and I was about to do the same thing that these people were killed for. It was kind of surreal. So I don't know, immediately I started thinking of ideas, and that idea just came for a hard day like that pretty quickly. I've had a lot of hard days over the years where you've had to come up with one single image that summed up what you thought was what you wanted to take out of that. And that day was rather easy, actually, surprisingly.
Chark, let me come to you. If the argument goes, if striking a blow for freedom is the goal, or one of the goals of satirical media, including Charlie Hebdo, does it work?
Does satire strike a blow for freedom?
Yes.
Well, in line with what I was saying earlier, it depends what kind of satire. I understand satire to be debunking the powerful, making the arrogant look small, laughing at our politicians, celebrities, the rich, and so on. So that, in that sense, that's a very healthy contribution to the creation and maintenance of a democratic culture. But stereotyping groups, stigmatizing vulnerable populations, making even more marginal people who are marginalized, and leading to a climate of opinion in which they're more likely to be discriminated, possibly attacked, certainly creating social divisions, well, there clearly it is anti-democratic.
You have argued, Tarek, in your writings, through your writings, that satire can be anti-democratic. Explain that. What do you mean by that?
Well, just what I was saying a moment ago. And in general, I mean, democracy requires communication. It also requires treating others as co-citizens, as equal co-citizens, sharing common concerns and participating in the common discourse. So if anything works to make some people feel unwanted, rejected, pushed out, that everybody else is laughing at them, or worse than laughing, that everybody thinks that they are inferior, stigmatized, then that's exactly what I mean by anti-democratic, because it's not contributing to inclusive democratic processes, and in fact it's not really contributing to dialogue. It becomes a one-way communication between the satirist or powerful people or the majority or whoever the satirist is able to mobilize with their images against the object of the satire. So that's certainly not democratic.
Natalie, go ahead.
I think that gives me a lot to think about, but it doesn't really jive with my view of satire, at this point anyway. I see satire as a really important tool in an essential to a democratic and free society. And I think that what satirists are doing, they're exercising their freedom and they're testing the limits of freedom in a given society. So,
has it always been this way? I mean, has satire always worked within those not even confines? I mean, it was just wide open?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And I think, sure, you are going to offend somebody, and in a way, it's not satire if you're not offending somebody. Satire is a rebellious form. I would call it an anti-dogmatic form. So I'll have to think about that idea about it being potentially anti-democratic. I see it as a tool of democracy and freedom, a means of challenging the status quo.
Where do you come in on this, Megan?
I am absolutely interested and support the use of satire for bringing truth to power, as our colleague has spoken about a number of times now. And I think there are really important differences between different modes of satire and what their object is. As I said, in Sacha Cohen's film Borat, the object of ridicule was everyday American people. I do not see what we have to gain by making fun of everyday people. What would be effective in creating a more equal, caring, compassionate society with less of the 99% and the 1%, what would be effective is pointing satire towards those in power who are creating the values and ideologies that are a problem. And similarly with these cartoons, what would it mean to say satire's job is to point at the institutionalized forms of religion or the churches as opposed to the figures of the spiritual leaders or an everyday individual who might or might not be a so-called alleged terrorist. I think it's very important to think about how do we speak truth to power, and that might mean really focusing on organized religion, on politicians, on those in power, and I think that was the point my colleagues were making.
Okay, let's bring up some cartoons that have appeared in Charlie Hebdo in the past that are not the ones that we've been focusing on as particularly this week. So let's bring up this first one. That, of course, is Michael Jackson there, and the translation into English is, you know, finally Michael Jackson is white. Okay, powerful guy, Michael Jackson. All right, let's bring up the next one. This is a depiction of Pope Francis, and here's what it says by loose translations. Pope in Rio prepared to do anything to solicit new clients. The analogy there is that is a comparison to soliciting prostitutes. And then this last one we'll bring up is for a White House that is truly white, not, no to the immigrant vote, and that's Romney there. Tarek, when you look at those three cartoons versus the ones we showed earlier, is there a difference between provoking and being incendiary? Is that where the line is for you?
Sorry, between provoking
and being incendiary.
Incendiary. Well, I thought the Romney one looked fairly standard, and Romney might, you know, wanted to protest that this was a distortion of his politics and so on, but it seemed like within the normal range of how politicians attack each other, and certainly, you know, cartoons portray politicians. I thought the Michael Jackson one was, again, it was amusing, and I mean, I suppose if it was at the time of his death, the moment is not perhaps you know, the right moment, an auspicious moment to be mocking him, but I didn't think it was kind of outrageous. Perhaps, as I say, the timing might be an issue. The Pope, yeah, this too is funny, and I suppose of the three, this is the one that I think, well, I mean, yeah, this is clearly irreverent, and again, I think that it's probably acceptable satire. I mean, I wouldn't certainly. I don't have a major problem with it, but I can imagine some people might. But I don't think they'd have a very long-lasting, deep problem with it. I think they're just, oh, this is the kind of thing I don't want to see, and walk away from it.
Well, the Pope soliciting as a prostitute, is that what one shows? I mean, it is, you know, satirizing religion to a certain extent, and that's the discussion that's been happening this week. I mean, Tarek, let me stay with you. Is there a difference between poking fun at a politician versus poking fun at religion?
Well, I think organized religion can approximate to politicians because, you know, obviously there are power structures and so on. The Prophet Muhammad has a particular role for many Muslims, perhaps all Muslims. But there are some Muslims, you know, who are more practicing a certain kind of devotional Islam in which the Prophet is really very deeply important to them, you know, to men and to women. And for them, something that is really outrageous and kind of sexually perverse in relation to someone who says this is meant to be the Prophet Muhammad, I think that can be quite deeply upsetting. You know, I've seen Muslim men and women cry at some portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad. So I think attacking power structures is very different to attacking objects of devotions, personalities of devotion.
You know what, I disagree, actually, you know. I mean, as a political cartoonist, we don't just attack power structures. We attack people. We attack viewpoints. I mean, same-sex marriage is a perfect example. I mean, there was a time where a vast majority of people didn't believe in same-sex marriage. Now it's evened out a little bit. But we cartoonists have been doing this from day one, you know, attacking basically the reader. The reader's reading this, and we're saying, you know, you're wrong about this. Same-sex marriage is a right, and you are wrong. And they might be devout Catholics, or it might be the priest that's reading this. And that goes, and these cartoons go back to Herblock. You know, Herblock attacked civil rights people, the average person, their viewpoints on how they viewed segregation in America. I think I attack politicians and individuals almost equally. I go after the power structures probably just 50% of the time. Half the time I'm going after the reader and saying, hey, if you believe in this, you think about it. I mean, so the whole idea that we're just going after the people in power is ridiculous. I'm sorry, that's just how I see it.
That's fair enough. That's why we have you all around the table. Megan's shaking her head, so I'm going to give her the last word, I think. Well,
I think the last three cartoons that you just showed were examples of what I would call dominant cultural power. We're talking about the question of whiteness in relation to Michael Jackson. We're talking about certain forms of Catholicism or Christianity, and in the last one as well. There's a question of attacking dominant cultural forms of power. And I think one thing that's important to think about in terms of the hate speech, while that is not a reason to censor, hate speech is defined in part as fighting words. And so if we're looking at an instance of a cartoon that is incendiary in the sense of inciting violence or pouring fuel on fire, I think we turn it back to the cartoonist and say, if there are a million ways to depict any one thing, how do you make those choices? How do you prompt people to think critically about power so that satire is effective in a political sense?
I want to thank all four of you. We have to leave it there. I know it's been a difficult week, and many of us are thinking about the role of satire, and I'm glad we all weighed in on this discussion. Thank you to all four of you. Now, as I mentioned, and as you saw during the discussion there, TVO has decided to publish the controversial cartoons out of Charlie Hebdo. It has been a debate amongst media organizations throughout this country, and many have made their different and own decisions. I want to mention that our colleague, producer John Michael McGrath, has written about this. You can check out his words at theagenda.tvo.org.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.